Welcome back to another episode of the Loco Fit Show, where we redefine what healthy means to you. I'm your host, Lauren Conlon, and this week I'm joined by Rick, our team mental health counselor, and we're going to talk about panic attacks. Yay!
Everybody's favorite.
Everybody's favorite. If you've had a panic attack, they are not great. And so first, let's just preface this. There's a lot of different terms and terminology and like panic attack disorder and all these different things. We're just going to talk in general about panic attacks, right? And
Correct.
You would say that there are people who have had instances like this who are not like diagnosed with anything. Like they kind of just come and go, right? Like that's pretty common.
Yeah. It's not uncommon for people to have panic attacks. And I think what makes them really scary the first few times you have them is if you've never had a history of having a panic attack ever before, or really even struggling with anxiety. If it develops, it oftentimes mimics the feelings of a heart attack, and people don't know what they're doing. And so they rush to the hospital. You know, they get an EKG, they go through all these tests, and the doctor comes back and says, no, everything is fine. You just had a panic attack. And so there is differences between panic attacks and anxiety attacks and panic disorders. And we're not going to get into all that because there's just subtle differences between some of those things. And I think most people benefit from just a general understanding of what is a panic attack and what's happening while I'm having one. And then how do I deal with them effectively?
Yeah, because that's the most important thing is how are we, how do we identify what this is, right? Not just, it's not like a normal experience, and it is very alarming, especially the first time that you have one. And whether this is something that's recurring or happens every once in a while, having tools that are going to help you get out of it sooner rather than later, or hopefully prevent it is going to be really key. But of course, caveat, if you are having very consistent recurring panic attacks, definitely stop listening to this and go reach out to somebody. I mean, this is really important. And this can, of course, escalate into other things. So if this is something that's not just like happens every once in a while, definitely need to get a handle on that. So see your provider.
Yeah, you definitely want to, if you're struggling with these things, you want to have kind of a community or a support system to really help you. And sometimes medication is necessary, especially if they're severe enough. People need help. And I would liken medication to basically saying, like, if something is so severe you can't manage it on your own, medication helps bring it back down to a space that's manageable for you to develop the skills needed. It's kind of like if your house is on fire, this isn't the time to learn how to put fires out, right? You needed to know that already. And so, you need kind of professionals to help you in that space, and whoever they are, go get that help. But
is it typically anti-anxiety meds, or is it going to be something specific to like panic disorders that I'm not aware of?
I would leave that up to the psychiatrist. I don't want to
I was just
start
curious.
rendering an opinion on something that's
sure.
way out of my scope. But I would imagine there are some medications that are going to be used. Anti-anxiety medications would be one of them. It depends also on what the psychiatrist also sees or hears in the evaluation. And so you can speak to your local psychiatrist or your doctor about that and see what they would prescribe. So what is a panic attack? By definition, most people would classify a panic attack as an abrupt surge of intense feelings of fear or discomfort that result from a feeling of being threatened or in danger. And what I want, I guess, to preface for everybody is that every single human being experiences anxiety. We all experience intense feelings of anxiety. And there are places and times where anxiety is normal. Like, for example, if you have a big test coming up, it's normal to have anxiety before that. Oftentimes what makes panic attacks challenging and scary for people is that they're very unpredictable, and they can happen out of nowhere, and they can happen in familiar and safe places. And so this is what makes panic attacks. And there's actually you can have anxiety, like future focused anxiety about having panic attacks because of the unpredictability of it all, which makes people even more scared of them. Right. Yeah.
Because you could, there's not always it's not always a correlation of this happened, then I had a panic attack, right? Like sometimes it's afterwards, right? It's like an after the fact kind of feeling, which is also very confusing because we're like, why is this happening now? Nothing is happening right now. I'm totally fine. Why is this occurring? But yeah, that's definitely one of the reasons. And I can see how that would create even more anxiety for people to then be afraid of it. It's just this never ending loop.
Well, imagine you're driving down the street and you've never had a panic attack before. And all of a sudden you start hyperventilating and you don't know why. And you're driving a car. Maybe you have kids in the car. Maybe you don't. it's scary. And so you pull over to the side of the road because you're thinking, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack. This has never happened to me before. And so it's this really terrifying thing. And that's where, when you think about the feelings of being threatened or in danger, that's oftentimes what's triggering it in your mind. And so we're going to get into a little bit of how panic attacks start to develop in people. And I'm pretty sure most of the people in here have heard of what's called like classical conditioning. Okay. Classical conditioning, for those of you that are listening that might be a little unaware what that is, like Pavlov's dogs is a perfect example of that. So what was Pavlov doing with the dogs? He was ringing a bell, and right after he rang the bell, he would feed the dogs. And he did this over and over again until eventually he would ring the bell and not give the dogs food, but he recognized they had been conditioned to salivate. So they associated, and this is the kind of the key word that I would use. It's more association. You associate experiences in your life with feelings and behavioral responses. Okay. And so if you look at Pavlov's experience with conditioning, let's say that took a month to occur. When we have a traumatic event, that entire month gets condensed into one event. And it's not always a direct correlation between what the association is for people. And that's usually where, once they start therapy or they start exploring it, we start to identify, like, what are you associating in your environment or that you're experiencing or that you're thinking that is triggering this response for you? Does that make sense? Okay. So obviously, I think like if you were to look at like anxiety attacks or what constitutes an anxiety attack, there's like 13 different criteria and you only need to meet 4 of them. I didn't write out all of them. I'm just going to give you guys some of the highlights of them. Common physical symptoms of a panic attack would be increase in heart rate, rapid breathing, or difficulty breathing, like you can't catch your breath at all, shortness of breath. Oftentimes there's chest pain. It mimics a heart attack, which is the first thing that most people who've never had one start to think. They're like, I'm having a heart attack. Yeah. Sweating, chest pain, nausea. These are common symptoms, dizziness, of panic attacks. So just generally think of what you see and feel with intense anxiety and a heart attack, and you basically have the criteria for a panic attack, which makes them so wonderful for people, right? And so it's also if you've ever witnessed somebody having a heart attack or a panic attack, you know how debilitating it is and how terrifying that experience is for that person. Because usually what's going through their mind is, oh my God, I'm going to die. And that's generally what they're thinking. Like, the most I can liken it to would be like if you've ever eaten food and you've started to choke on it. And in that sudden instant, your breath is taken away and there's nothing you can do. There's just this level of panic that sets in where you're like, oh my God, like, what do I do? And if you've experienced that, that's like the tip of an iceberg for what a panic attack feels like for most people.
Yeah, that's like the worst part, when you like can't breathe, like that, like, right. Okay, I like some of the physical symptoms beforehand, like are like leading up to that, and you're like, all right, this could go either way, you know what I mean? But then that's like when it's just super scary.
It jumps off the charts.
It just never gets easier. But I would say after the first time you've had it, you can typically pick up on those symptoms and be like, all right, this is not normal. You know what I mean? Like, how I'm feeling is not normal. And then hopefully you might be able to catch it if you're able to, you know, change your environment or change your state, because it doesn't just like, it does happen quickly, but not that quickly, right? Like there are like steps, at least in my experience, but maybe not for everybody.
Not for everybody, but that's part of the treatment model. Is like the first thing you need to do is educate yourself. Like, okay, this isn't a heart attack. This is a panic attack. And now that I know that I have these things, like, what are panic attacks? How do I start educating myself and developing tools and coping mechanisms for it? So education becomes kind of the first thing in helping clients recover from them. But as I said before, panic attacks can happen anywhere and at any time. And so I think sometimes one of the misconceptions or myths of a panic attack is that, like, I'm going to have a panic attack when I'm in a dangerous situation. It's like, nope, you could be sitting on your couch at home in the safest place for you, which is generally most people's homes. And that's where a panic attack can strike. You can have a panic attack with your husband or wife right next to you. You can have a panic attack while your kids are in the car. You can have a panic attack while you're sitting at a baseball game. It can come on anywhere at any time. It doesn't have to be like I'm in a war zone or there was a car crash or something like that. And so I think sometimes people associate these things with like high stress or high chaotic environments. That's not the case. In fact, most people start to experience them in safe places that are familiar.
Wouldn't you say that it actually probably is more along those lines, but it's in response to the high stressful situation, right? or no?
What do you mean?
Like the high stressful situation that you might be talking about, right? Like maybe somebody has dealt with that, but now they're having potentially the panic attack at a later time when they are in a safer place because like they've gotten through that really stressful event, but now they're kind of like, actualizing it and like materializing it, and then that's when they're feeling it. Or why do you think that it happens when they're in a more calm state?
It happens, well, why they happen and where and when or why they happen is kind of the mystery. The idea, though, is that the pattern that it starts to follow is the intrusive thought hits your mind. And wherever that intrusive thought comes from can be triggered by a lot of different things. You were to look at your senses, right? It could be something that you see. It could be something that you hear. It could be something that you felt. It could be something that you smell, right? Like for me, I was in a car accident when I was 17 years old. I'll never forget the smell of the airbag, right? Every time I've driven by a car accident where an airbag has gone off, it brings me right back to it. And that was one incident in my life. And that was, like 30 years ago almost. And so my mind has associated those things. And so it can be triggered by anything. And here's the thing, when you start talking about trauma, like if the panic attack is a result of trauma, and you start going down these things, it's like, it could be, you recognize, why am I feeling uneasy with Lauren in the room? Like I don't understand that, like Lauren's safe to me. She's always been somebody who's safe. She's always been somebody that I trust. Why am I now starting to feel panic when I'm around Lauren? And you realize, well, the situation that you were in when you were in a car accident, the person next to you had really long black hair. And you remember right before the car hit you, this like black hair, like shooting everywhere. And so you're like, these are the weird associations that we pick up. Like your mind almost takes a snapshot of this like really insignificant moment or these like almost insignificant details, but are the permanent details that your mind latches onto. And you don't know why. You don't know if it's a smell. You might remember like putting on your lip gloss before you did something, and now like that is the one thing that you remember. Or the person had a beard, or they were wearing a particular cologne, or you remember the feel of the grass, whatever and so your mind starts to associate all these different textures and smells and feels with everything. And so part of the idea of getting to the root cause of the panic disorder or panic attack is to identify like, what are some of the triggers that are around this for you, and how is it being triggered? Oftentimes what I find is people are having thoughts about something that triggers these feelings, and that's what the intrusive thoughts are. So generally the cycle follows like this. I have intrusive thoughts which enter my mind like I'm in danger. That's the thought. I immediately start to feel the arousal symptoms. My heart starts pounding. I can't breathe. I'm sweating. And then avoidance features are either something that can happen in the moment where I try and run away from whatever's causing the panic, or avoidance features can take shape later when I think like, okay, I do podcasts with Lauren in this building, and let's say I was assaulted in this building. So one of the features I start to do is I start to find like a different way to go home just to avoid driving by the building. That's avoidance. Like there's a behavioral approach where you're like, here, I wrote it down. A significant maladaptive change in behavior related to the attacks. So you're basically avoiding going to places or avoiding meeting people or avoiding certain situations or experiences because you've associated those with the panic or the fear or the danger. And so you're specifically avoiding them. Like I had a firefighter who was having panic attacks, and he had responded to a terrible call where a family was burned in a car. And when we started working together, he was at a point where he was like taking a really long way home so he could avoid driving by the Burger King, because the Burger King has that like flame broiled, so it had like this chimney where you could smell burgers and charcoal, and it was too much for him. And so like that's a classic avoidance feature. That's what it looks like in people, where you start recognizing, I'm going to do things differently to avoid these situations. And
would you say that that's a negative thing to do, or is that something that someone should be doing or should do at a certain point and then take away the behavior, right? Like, because maybe in the beginning, right? Like I could see in the beginning, like right afterwards, like, right, I don't maybe want to trigger that memory, but a year later, that could become maybe more of like a maladaptive thing. Or what's the more clinical approach there?
There's two kinds of schools of thought. There's actually a little bit more detail than I was looking to get, but there's safety behaviors and then there's coping skills. Sometimes people will classify certain avoidance behaviors as safety skills. Like, for example, if confronting the trigger for whatever reason is too intense for me right now, or I don't have the ability or the community or the support system to confront it, I look to avoid it. And so I stay in like safer places. I might stay in my house a little bit more, but the danger becomes, and I've talked about this with coping skills, sometimes the coping skills that you use and develop earlier in life or as a result of something that are designed to kind of make you feel safe end up being the thing that hurts you later. So if I turn to my house and staying in my home as a safe place, well, I run the risk, and this has happened, where people become more agoraphobic. Mm-hmm. They have this fear of going out into the world because you've completely removed all elements of danger, and your house is the only place that you feel safe because the rest of the world has now become a dangerous place. Mm-hmm. And so now we have a lot of work to do. And so obviously in an ideal world, you want the person to know and understand that they're safe and start to confront these things. So yes, there's times when safety behaviors are necessary and okay, but generally speaking, we want to get to a space where we can develop the coping skills to really deal with it. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then I guess depending on, of course, the situation is really going to depend on the timeline. Like obviously that was a very intense situation, so it's like, all right, that might take longer for this person to work through that. Mm-hmm. But if it was something maybe smaller scale, like would you want to, as a therapist, like increase or quicken the time course, I guess, that you are moving away from those, or no? It's just really going to be dependent on the individual.
I want to meet the individual where they're at, and I want to work at a pace that's comfortable for them. If you push too far too fast, you run the risk of them not absorbing it, and either like that could be like we tried to take 2 steps forward and ended up taking 10 steps back. And so, if the person's like, Rick, I want to be back at my job doing this at this day and time, like sometimes it doesn't quite work that way. Like when you feel safe, you feel safe. When you feel ready to confront it, you feel ready to confront it. And so that's basically what that is. And so intrusive thoughts or triggers, again, think about your 5 senses that can trigger these things. You might see something, feel something, hear something that triggers the thought that says, I'm in danger. And the physical symptoms generally follow. Some of the diagnostic criteria for this would again be an abrupt surge in intense feelings of fear or discomfort, okay? That come as a result of you feeling a sense of threat or danger. The next thing would be, at least one of the panic attacks, or at least your one panic attack, has persistent worry or concern about additional panic attacks. This is more or less for like diagnostic criteria, which if you've had one panic attack, it's very, very normal. I want to assure people who have had panic attacks or who might be having one now, that the fear of having another panic attack is a very real thing. I don't want you to discount that. I don't want you to think like you're somehow crazy or weird or something's wrong with you because you're like, oh my God, I had a panic attack and now I'm not having a panic attack, but I'm worried about having another one. Like totally normal. Like that's a part of confronting this. And so if you've thought that, and maybe been hard on yourself for it, like take a step back and realize it's okay. And
how common is this, like with your clients?
Common.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to do this, because I feel like people hear stuff like this and they're like, panic attacks, that sounds so crazy. Mm-hmm. Like you must be completely like just debilitated. And it's like, not, like this is something that is pretty common. And that's why when I asked you and you're like, yeah, a lot of clients deal with this. Mm-hmm. And of course it's going to be varying levels. Yeah. But I do want to assure people also that like, this is fairly common, and not to feel like, oh my gosh, there's something that's super wrong with me, Right. There are certainly strategies that we can use to hopefully improve or lessen the symptoms. Mm-hmm. But just knowing that this is something that happens, I feel like can sometimes be reassuring for people. Especially when maybe you're dealing with it and nobody else that deals with them. Mm-hmm. And you're like, oh gosh, like, do I bring this up again? Or how do I bring this up? Or do I sound, like, and then people always like to, whether they mean to or not, they say things and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that wasn't helpful, but thanks so much. So just knowing that if you've had one, the fear of having another one is certainly valid and Absolutely. Normal. And also knowing that you are certainly not alone if this is something that has happened in your life. But we do want to obviously share some strategies to help you here. Mm-hmm. And like we said, if this is happening on a really, really recurring basis, this is maybe something that you need to not tackle on your own and right. need help with.
Yeah. Professional help might be some of the support that you want to develop in a space like this. And then again, one of the other criteria was a significant behavior change as a result of the attacks, which means, again, you're creating a scenario where you're avoiding specific triggers, places, people, situations. And then, of course, we want to make sure that the panic attacks aren't developing as a result of any medical or substance abuse problems, or can't be better explained by some other mental health disorder. Okay, that's just general kind of criteria for most stuff. So I kind of want to get into just a few steps that people can start to take if they're wondering, like, well, I've had panic attacks before, or I know somebody who does. What are some things, and what does treatment generally look like for somebody who has this? Well, first and foremost, the first thing we want to do is start to educate people on what panic attacks are and what they're feeling, what they're going through, the sensations in their body, the thoughts that they're having. It's to educate yourself. Because when it starts to happen, you don't know what it is. You don't know why it's happening. And that's really scary, because we're always afraid of the things that we don't know or understand. And so the uncertainty of future and what you're feeling right now becomes very overwhelming. Okay. So the idea becomes, the first thing we want to do is know what it is and start to educate ourselves on it. Like, panic attacks are normal. I'm not going to die. And so right now, what we're starting to do is starting to rewrite the script in our head, right? Your mind has created a scenario where it's flipped from the world is safe to everything is dangerous. And so there's this interplay between learning again what is a safe environment where feeling calm and relaxed is normal, versus a dangerous environment where my feelings of heightened sensitivity make sense. The problem becomes people start interpreting safe environments as dangerous. And this is where panic attacks start to develop out of. So knowledge is your ally in a situation like this. Number 2, one of the things that I generally start to do is I start to ask people to start writing about their panic attacks. This is everybody's favorite step, because they love talking about it so much. And they love, when you say journaling now, you either get people who smile at you and they're like, oh my God, I love journaling. Like, yay, I get to write. Yay. And then you get people who are like, fuck you. Why do I have to write? You know,
I don't want to relive this. Part of it is having to relive it, right?
Some of it is.
That's one of the things, but also just like, there is something about getting those thoughts out that is so absolutely essential and powerful. And like, I used to be one of those people who would roll my eyes so hard at journaling. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need to do that. I write or I think all the time. But there is a difference of, honestly, there is a difference of thinking about something versus talking about it versus writing it.
Yeah.
Like, there is absolutely a huge difference.
And writing, one of the reasons why writing about it is one of the more effective ways is that when we start to journal, we start to access our subconscious. Okay. And when you think about some of the connections and associations your mind has made to whatever that situation is, oftentimes people aren't aware of it. It's not on the surface. So you have to dig a little bit. This is where we start getting into the connections and the triggers and the senses and all these other things. And so writing about that is like, it becomes this outlet. It becomes a way to access the things that you aren't consciously aware of. And so think about that from that conditioning perspective. Like, the dogs didn't know why they were doing that. So you have to start to explore that space. And again, it's very cathartic to start to write about it, to confront it, to hear it.
And ultimately, as a coach or as a therapist or really any practitioner, you can't help someone. And if you're just listening and you're doing this on your own, you can't help yourself until you actually know and truly understand the kind of why behind something that's happening, right? And a lot of times, like, someone could come and say, hey, I'm having a panic attack. Well, we could maybe make assumptions to be like, all right, well, here's probably some of the reasons why. But until you actually reflect your own experience to how would we know that? You know, how would we know all those details? And can't create strategies unless we actually know that. So sometimes, especially like, this is not for a panic situation, but like, let's say a client situation with me, someone will say, oh, like a common situation, but I'll be like, I need you to like reflect and write on this and like explore these bullet points and these thoughts and then get back to me, because I'm just shooting in the dark unless I have a general idea. I can probably nail about 80% of it. You know what I mean? But until you share and reflect more information, then I'm not going to be able to really give better strategies.
Right. And
this also takes time, right? Like, I'm thinking of a client situation where, you know, originally it presented as one thing, and then over time I was like, actually, no, like with more data, with more information, with more reflection from her, it's actually like this. And like, this is actually what the root is. But that took us months to figure out, and a lot of reflection, thankfully, and sharing on her part, to me. But it's like, until you're ready to actually face that, like just saying, oh, I'm dealing with some panic or panic attacks, like nobody, even yourself, is going to be able to help you.
Right. And things evolve. You start with a hypothesis and it continues to grow and develop. One of the next steps that we start to teach people are breathing, relaxation, and grounding skills. Now, depending on where the person's at, you might teach these first, okay? Because if the person is suffering from a lot of panic attacks or intense panic attacks, sometimes developing like the skills to deal with them in that acute situation is really important, right? And so some typical breathing patterns can be a lot of different things. I've seen people do like an inhale of 4, hold for 2, and an exhale of 4. For those of you who are Huberman podcast fans, he talks about the physiological sigh a lot, which is a specific breathing pattern where he goes 2 in, hold, 4-second exhale. And that's specifically designed to reduce stress and return the central nervous system back to a ground space. So breathing techniques are one aspect of it. The other part of it is, remember, a panic attack attacks you physically as well. So learning systematic muscle relaxation or body relaxation, these are important things. So learning skills to develop relaxing, how to tense your muscles and then relax and sink into a chair. Those are important skills. Grounding skills are also important. Here's why. I can explain this using 2 metaphors, and these are usually the 2 that I use. There's 2 parts of your brain, right? There's the brain that you're using right now, which is like the neocortex part of the brain, which is the part that's responsible for all this higher level thinking and function. And then you have, most people refer to it as like your reptilian brain, which is like stored in the limbic system, which is where your fight, flight, and freeze response is. And when you look at a panic attack is a fight, flight, or freeze response. And so think of it like this. Think of it like the limbic system in the fight, flight, or freeze response is a light bulb that's off. And the limbic system, and the neocortex is a bright light bulb that's burning, okay? And you're thinking and you're doing this. Well, all of a sudden, if somebody runs into this building with a gun, right, your neocortex is going to shut down, it's going to turn off, and your limbic system is going to fire up. And that fight, flight, or freeze, so like one light bulb is going to close, and the other one's going to get really bright. Because now you're not going to be like, well, geez, did we record this podcast right? What's the editing going to be like? You're just thinking about survival. And so that's why it's stored in this space. Like, this is the part of your brain when our ancestors were running away from animals or had legitimate threats, it developed as a way to keep you alive. And so I liken it to like, when we start to use these skills, what we're attempting to do is the reptilian part of your brain is on because it's sensing danger. And by using specific grounding skills, what we're trying to do is like create a conflict in your mind where this one starts to like flicker and this one starts to turn back on. So you have to create a space where you recognize that what I'm going through, there's no real threat. My mind is thinking there's a threat, but there isn't one that exists. It's kind of like, when you're looking through old pictures, right? And you grab one and you start looking at it and you're laughing and you go right back to that space. That's what your mind does. It pulls that memory from a year ago or 2 months ago, and it pulls it to like right now. And so like grounding techniques, one of my favorite ones, I've even talked about it, I think on the podcast before, is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can smell, 1 thing that you can taste. And I will literally ask people to go through this, not fast, but I'll be like, all right, look around the room and describe to me what you're seeing. So I'll look up at the ceiling and I'll see like sound panels that are black and have all these squiggly lines. I'll look at the black microphone that's in front of me. I'll look at the wall that has, white and gray lines on it. You just start to describe what you're seeing. I'll start saying, what do you feel? So you start to feel your shirt, like it's cotton, soft, right? My jeans are denim. I'll feel my pen. It's like smooth rubber. And you describe these things. What do you hear? Close your eyes. Listen. Like I can hear Lauren breathing in the microphone.
I try my hardest not to heavy breathe in here, but listen, guys, I got some ENT issues. All right.
Well,
I need a nose
the microphone and the earphones really pick up a lot.
I think
of
I
sound.
have. What's that thing when your nose is all messed up?
Deviated septum.
I think I have that.
Okay.
Or at least I tell myself that to make me feel better that I breathe so loudly. I just have a DVD system.
But like AC ducts or kids playing outside or cars driving by, etc. So what you're doing with all these things is when your limbic system in that fight, flight, or freeze response is turned on, think of it like a hot air balloon that's floating off into space. And the higher up it gets, the worse it gets, because that's not reality. That's just fantasy that's up there. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to grab like the rope that's on that thing, and we're trying to pull that hot air balloon back down to earth. So remember, your mind is going back and pulling up a memory that doesn't actually exist anymore, and it's pulling it to the here and now. And so your brain is thinking, well, this is actually happening now. But the reality is what's happening now for most of us is what we can see, what we can touch, what we can hear, what we can smell, and what we can taste. That's what's real to us. So using this grounding skill, and by the way, there's like 1,000 grounding skills that people can teach you how to use. This is one of the more effective ones because it can be done anywhere, anytime, by yourself. And so I really like it for that reason. And what it does is it creates that conflict in the brain between what it senses as danger versus what's real. Mm-hmm. And it gives you that space between breathing and relaxing and grounding yourself in the moment to be like, okay, I'm in control.
Would you also recommend, now granted someone's in a position to do this like safely, to like change their environment, whether it's like change a room or like go outside again, like if you're in the throes of a panic attack, maybe like don't get in the car, obviously that, but like if you're inside and you're like, let me go outside on my patio, or let me go into a different room, like are those kinds of things useful as well because it's going to change their state? Yes,
it can. We're all influenced by our environment, right? And so sometimes like walking outside,
go touch grass.
It's not. I don't feel enclosed. I don't feel trapped.
And that also kind of feels more real because you're like, okay, this is real. Like there's the sun and here is the grass, and I can feel these things.
Absolutely.
Now again, if you're if you're able to do that, but I would imagine, and even if it's just a different room in your house, like okay, down here this was all happening. Let me go upstairs. Let me like wash my hands with cold water. Let me take a shower if I can stand up. Let me, those things I feel like can be really useful. I know the cold water thing a lot of people talk about too with like, dunking your head in cold water, or taking a cold shower, especially like behind your neck. If you got makeup on, listen, like people just put your head in a bowl of cold water all in the middle of the day. Okay. I'm not doing that, but shower if possible. You know what I mean? Then I'm going to have a panic attack because now my makeup's running everywhere. I'm going to have two. No, just kidding. If you really need to do that, definitely do that. But it is a little bit impractical if you are a female who's wearing makeup. But I'm just going to leave it at that. If you have a cold plunge, definitely do that. But, again, most of the time, this is going to happen in a not ideal time, so it's not going to be like, ooh, during my morning routine when I'm already doing this, like, let me just, oops, I'm having a panic attack, right? Like, it's probably going to happen at an unideal time. So you're probably not going to be able to stop everything, jump in a cold tub. I mean, that would be great if you could or you had access to that. But again, the chances are, what are some things that we can easily do? And like you said, find a grounding technique that you can do, change your state, change your environment safely. But I think that is really helpful.
Yeah. And then again, starting to address kind of the thought changing around what is dangerous versus what is safe, and reaffirming that with yourself, because you're kind of rewiring your brain. Your brain was working great. An event happened that traumatized it. And now we need to rewire it, so to speak. And then the last thing, and this is where sometimes having a professional helps, is you start using exposure therapy techniques. For those of you that are unaware of what exposure therapy is, it's basically baby steps in a nutshell. Oftentimes, like for example, if you have a client who's afraid of heights, okay, one of the things I'll do is I'll have them sit down, close their eyes, and we will create a visual image, like through talking, of them like getting in an elevator and going up to the 5th floor or something like that.
Or getting stuck in the elevator like earlier today. That was so much fun.
And what that feels like. And as they're experiencing anxiety in the office or in the session, they start to use the skills necessary to calm themselves and self-soothe, and more importantly, self-rescue. Having friends that you turn to and all those other things are wonderful. But the reality is, I want people to develop the ability to rescue themselves in that space, because sometimes it happens when no one else is around. And so exposure therapy is essentially like, all right, we're going to start by talking about it. And how do you feel about that? Great. And then, you might bring in like a step stool and they stand on the step stool, and it's like, how do you feel? They're like, I feel fine. This is kind of ridiculous, but okay. And then maybe you bring in a 3-step ladder and you have them stand up on that. And so now they're 4 feet off the ground. Like, okay, like this is too much. Like so you back it off. If 3 steps is too much, go down to 2. Mm-hmm. Can you handle 2? 2 is great. And then we prepare and we just slowly work up. And you get to a point where maybe they walk into a building and instead of taking an elevator, they take 10 flights of stairs. It's like, how do you feel? You walk up to the window. Am I good? No, this is too much. And so it's just this gradual pushing, okay? It's not flooding, and I want you guys to understand that. Flooding is not helpful for most people. Flooding is where you just basically like push them into the worst case scenario and hope for the best. And their exposure to everything that they're afraid of is supposed to make them think that, oh, I was terrified of all this happening, and now I realize I'm not terrified because I'm surviving in it. And it oftentimes can produce more harmful damage. Like, I liken it to the Indiana Jones snake pit. Indiana Jones, the character, was afraid of snakes. And there's like a scene where he gets dropped into a pit full of snakes. That
Fear
would
factor.
be, yeah, that would be, okay, yeah.
No, and, that's that's kind of the premise of that.
The idea would be, though, that you don't already have a pre-existing fear of that. And now you're going to be thrown into that space.
Oh, hell no.
And so that can be really dangerous. So exposure therapy is just gradually exposing the person.
Hey, do you want a panic attack? Go do that.
Yes. Gradually expose them to the things that are dangerous or perceived as dangerous, and then help them manage it through that. And it gets to a point where, oftentimes the anxiety doesn't necessarily disappear, but it becomes manageable. You take it from that 10 where they're having a panic attack and it drops to a 4. And they're like, okay, I might be nervous, I might be scared, but I can manage this. And they have the skills to do it.
It's like the whole thing with like heights, right? And people are like, oh, are you scared of heights? And I'm like, I feel like I have a normal, healthy fear of heights. Like, I don't think it's normal to like stand on something that's really tall and like that you could possibly fall and like not be a little bit afraid. But I'm not like incapacitated to where I can't like take an elevator. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, so there's probably always going to be some level of like we talk about in general with like any mood, right? Like you're never going to have none of no anxiety or like no depression in your body ever again, So it's like you might still feel a little bit fearful of certain things, but it's about regulating like the level that you're going to feel that at. And then after you've kind of worked through this, right? And so now we're past the panic attack, like you're back to normal, which generally, would you say, in my experience, it happens fairly quickly? Like it's kind of like a sort of quick turnaround time, but like how long, just for people listening, like do you generally hear people reporting like the turnaround time?
Look, I hate using the answer I'm about to use, but it's really on the individual because some people do the work like with such intensity and such passion, and then there's other people who just don't.
I mean like literally the event, like you're having a panic attack, like, and then
minutes,
when does it
usually
go back to normal? Okay,
minutes.
Yeah, so you might feel a little weird for maybe a few hours, but like you will get back to. It's not going to be like for 6 weeks you're going to feel like this.
No,
it's going to be there's going to be the peak, and then it's going to be kind of that weird come down, and then you're going to feel back to normal. That's what I was asking.
Yeah.
But then so say you are back to normal, maybe not that day, but maybe later in the week, and you can start to address maybe some of the intrusive thoughts, right? Do you think that would be one of the best things that someone could do, is to, when they're in a non-panic state, to actually start to address that if they've noticed that, okay, like it's specifically around one thought or one type of thought, is that really where they should be focusing their efforts?
Yeah, where and when you start to recognize the thoughts that are triggering it, I want you to write those down immediately, and
or even like the behaviors, right? Like the behaviors.
What are my avoidance behaviors? What are my,
what could have contributed here? And then you start to see a pattern like, oh, every time I don't do this, then this, happens easier.
Yeah.
Right? Or because it's not always like when we do certain things, it's also when we don't do certain things. And those are the ones that people like, we always forget about. It's like not always like, what are we adding? It's like, what have we not done that we know makes us feel better?
Right. It's like that proactive approach to like, stress is on the horizon. I can do some things now to lower my, my stress levels. Yeah. So this way, when stress meets me,
then okay.
Yeah. Or I can not do anything now and walk in there already elevated, and then when more stress hits, it gets up, and it's like it's so much easier to manage it when it's at like a 6 or a 7 instead of an 8, 9, or a 10.
Definitely. So we wanted to go over this, you guys, because it is really common. It's something that I've experienced many times. I know that you've mentioned many of your clients experience it as well. So we did want to, for lack of a better word, normalize this conversation and also give you guys some practical tips, because this is something that you may deal with in your life. And we're all about being proactive and working through things in a very introspective way. So we hope you found use out of this podcast and some good tips. Or if it's someone in your life maybe deals with this that you're very close with, hopefully you can share this with them. But for more information on your services, how can they reach you for counseling?
They could email at fullcircletherapy.com.
That's not the email.
Oh, fullcircletherapyfl@gmail.com.
Way to go. Don't send the first email, send the second one. And for more information on all of our services, you can visit teamlogofit.com. If you guys enjoyed the show, please share it. That is the best way that you can help spread our message. We appreciate you guys listening, and we'll talk to you next week.